Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. Fort Ontario was the longest existing operating fortress in the Finger Lakes in history. In this program, you will learn that there were several Fort Ontarios built. You will also learn that it was the site of the last American colonial military offensive in the American Revolutionary War, taking place over a year after British commander Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. Fort Ontario was also the site of the only Holocaust refugee facility in the United States during World War II. Today, Fort Ontario is a state historic site. It began as one of several forts erected by the British to protect the area around the east end of Lake Ontario from the French. Control of the mouth of the Oswego River had been vital to the interests of the Iroquois Confederacy, as well as for the French, the British, and the United States. This is because the Oswego River is part of a largely all-water route of the Hudson River, Mohawk River, Oneida Lake, Oswego River passage from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Only the St. Lawrence River provided an alternative water route past the great physical barrier of the Appalachian Mountains. The nation that controlled the Oswego River could gain a decisive military advantage as well as considerable influence in trade and Indian relations. In 1772, the British built a fort named Fort Oswego near the mouth of the Oswego River. However, it was located on the west side of the Oswego River. Until 1722, the French held a virtual monopoly on the Great Lakes fur trade. In the year 1722, the Onondaga Nation of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee granted New York's British colonial governor permission to establish a trading post and a fort at Oswego. This fort was just a wooden structure. Within just a few years, the furs sent from this British colonial Oswego settlement made up approximately 2/3 of the volume of fur trade in Albany. In 1726, the French built Fort Niagara at the mouth of the Niagara River, near the western end of Lake Ontario. This led the British in 1727 to replace their wooden palisade structure in Oswego with a stone fortification. Tensions between Britain and France were intensifying. These tensions between France and Britain continued to heighten until actual war broke out in 1754. We call this war the French and Indian War. In Europe, it tended to be called the 7 Years' War. Although there were problems in Europe between France and England, the growing tensions here in North America were major reasons for this outbreak of fighting in 1754. Part of this was the rivalry between France and England for control of trade, such as fur trade in the Great Lakes region. Oswego got caught up directly in these tensions. I have included this map so that you have a good geographic perspective for this program. The red line shows the route that the British were using for their trade and supplies to Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario. This water route consisted of the Hudson River to the Mohawk River, with a portage along Wood Creek to Oneida Lake to the Oswego River to Fort Ontario. On this map, I have also shown the location of the British Fort Stanwix on that water route and the location of the French fort, Fort Niagara, near the western end of Lake Ontario. With the outbreak of the French and Indian War, the British built more fortifications at the mouth of the Oswego River. A new fort was built on the east side of the Oswego River. This is our first Fort Ontario, built in 1755. Major General William Shirley improved the defenses of Oswego by erecting earthworks around Fort Oswego, constructing a Fort George on the ridge to the west of Fort Oswego, launching British vessels on Lake Ontario, and building this first Fort Ontario on the bluff on the eastern side of the Oswego River. Nevertheless, all these fortifications remained vulnerable to French artillery fire. In 1756, French commander the Marquis de Montcalm organized a systematic campaign to isolate and capture the city of Oswego. In mid-August 1756, the French attack on these fortifications began. Fort Ontario was evacuated August 13th and Fort George the next day. The commander of Fort Oswego was killed by a cannonball. Fort Oswego troops surrendered, with more than 100 sick and wounded in hospitals being killed by Indian allies of Montcalm's French forces. King Louis XV of France considered Montcalm's capture of Oswego to be so important that he featured this achievement on a 1758 medal. Montcalm did not garrison Oswego, but he returned it to the Onondaga Nation as a diplomatic gesture intended to gain their favor. The British realized it was important to rebuild some kind of defense at the mouth of the Oswego River. After all, it was the British gateway to the Great Lakes region. Following an unsuccessful surprise French attack on July 5, 1759, the British began to build a new Fort Ontario. During the summer of 1760, the British gathered an army of 10,000 troops and 1,000 Iroquois warriors at this new second Fort Ontario to attack Montreal. The surrender of Montreal led to the end of fighting in this French and Indian War. So you can see that much of the success of the British over the French in this French and Indian War was due to British control of the mouth of the Oswego River. In the years after the French and Indian War and before the start of the American Revolutionary War, Fort Ontario had a much lesser role. One notable achievement in this time period, however, was that just outside of the Fort Ontario itself, there was a peace conference to resolve the Pontiac Rebellion, in which Indian troops had allied themselves but unsuccessfully tried to drive the British out of the Great Lakes region. With the start of the American Revolutionary War, the British devised a three-part military campaign to gain control of New York and separate the rebellious colonies into two parts, the New England colonies separated from the colonies south of New York. As part of that military campaign, British Brigadier Barry St. Leger was to proceed from Fort Ontario through the Oswego, Oneida, Mohawk route to Albany. St. Leger's British forces, however, encountered unexpected resistance at colonial rebel-held Fort Stanwix. After a hard-fought battle near Oriskany on August 6, 1777, St. Leger abandoned his move east and returned to Fort Ontario. At Fort Ontario, he rounded up the garrison and artillery there and returned to Canada. As a result, Fort Ontario remained without a regular garrison of soldiers for some time. Then, in July 1778, Continental troops from Fort Stanwix burned Fort Ontario's buildings. Then the ruined Fort Ontario post became a base for Loyalist and Iroquois raiding parties on rebel frontier settlements. In 1782, the British rebuilt Fort Ontario. This is the third Fort Ontario. General George Washington was afraid that a rebuilt British Fort Ontario might be a prelude to another invasion of continental U.S. Americans in the Mohawk Valley. So Washington ordered Colonel Marinus Willett to undertake a surprise attack against Fort Ontario in February 1783. Keep in mind that it was the Battle of Yorktown in October 1781 that we say marked the end of the war. But Washington ordered Colonel Willett to attack Fort Ontario, but only if the attack could be made by surprise. Colonel Willett's forces were bogged down by wind-driven snow and extreme cold, and did not reach the fort until sunrise on the day planned for the surprise attack. Too late for a surprise attack. Willett abandoned the effort and returned back to Fort Herkimer in the Mohawk Valley. On February 14, 1783, British King George III proclaimed a cessation of hostilities. So Willett's unsuccessful trek to surprise attack Fort Ontario was the last campaign of the war to be ordered by the Continental Army Commander-in-Chief Washington. The United States had won its independence, but the British kept posts in the Great Lakes region, including Fort Ontario and 6 other posts. In the Treaty of Paris 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States and agreed that the United States would have all of the territory east of the Mississippi in what is today the United States, shown in the 2 different shades of red on the map. But the British continued to hold on to 7 military posts in the Great Lakes region, including Fort Ontario at the mouth of the Oswego River. Yes, the United States was recognized as an independent nation by Britain in this Treaty of Paris of 1783, with the western boundary of the United States to be the Mississippi, but the British continued to occupy those 7 military posts. That was true until most of the provisions of the Jay Treaty were ratified in February 1796. Finally, on July 5, 1796, the British withdrew from Fort Oswego, and American troops under Captain James Bruff took over. In the next few years, the civilian community of Oswego grew in size, based on the growing trade business of transferring goods from river to lake vessels, or vice versa. Here you see a woodcut print of what Oswego looked like in 1798. In 1803, the Thomas Jefferson administration removed troops from Fort Ontario as tensions between France and England were increasing, and he didn't want the United States to get drawn into such a war. Then the 1807 Embargo Act stopped Americans from trading with warring England and France, and this hurt the growing Oswego trade with Canada. Tensions between the United States and Great Britain, however, grew so great that in 1812 the United States declared war on Great Britain. The war became known as the War of 1812, although it lasted into 1814. Fort Ontario was protecting this Mohawk, Oneida Lake, Oswego River water route that carried essential supplies to shipyards, sailors, and troops at Sackett's Harbor and to Army campaigns on the Niagara frontier and to the St. Lawrence River. With few American troops based at Fort Ontario, the fort became an easy target for British attempts to win naval superiority by disrupting supply shipments and stores in U.S. government warehouses in the Oswego Harbor. On June 19, 1813, British forces attacked Fort Ontario, but they were repulsed. That same day, British troops burned Sodus Bay facilities and made shore landing at Pulteneyville. On May 5, 1814, British forces returned to take control of Fort Ontario. The British forces outnumbered the American forces 4-1. On May 5th, it was a naval bombardment. On May 6th, successive assault waves of troops reached the shore and stormed Fort Ontario. American Commander Lieutenant Colonel George Mitchell ordered U.S. forces to retreat from the fort, retreating to Oswego Falls, present-day Fulton, New York, to defend the naval stores there. The British seized stores and destroyed wharfs and warehouses in Oswego and destroyed Fort Ontario before departing. Nevertheless, the Americans within 2 weeks again were sending supplies through Oswego to Sackett's Harbor, but the United States made no effort to rebuild Fort Ontario. It would lie in ruins for the next 24 years. In 1837, there was a rebellion against the British government of Upper Canada. Many Americans saw this as an opportunity for the United States to free Canada from British rule. But President Van Buren's administration sought to preserve peace through a policy of strict neutrality. However, starting in August 1839, a new Fort Ontario, the fourth version of such a Fort Ontario, was being built. This new fort was simply built of earth and timber, not the exterior stone walls of the fort today. Fort Ontario was not the site of any actual fighting during the Civil War, but Fort Ontario still played an important role during the Civil War. Out of fear that the British might invade the United States from Canada, the United States War Department built additional fortifications at Fort Ontario. At the bottom, you see some of those fortifications being built. During the Civil War, Fort Ontario served as a recruitment and training facility for U.S. troops. Interestingly, when the draft riots broke out in New York City in early July 1863, the U.S. government brought many federal records from New York City to Fort Ontario for safekeeping. This is an aerial view of what Fort Ontario looked like with the completion of these new fortifications early on in the Civil War. Here you see two officers' quarters buildings as they looked in 1870 at the top, and those two other buildings as they look today. Following the building of the present Fort Ontario in 1871, the successive years were characterized by a decline. Changes in weaponry and tactics, as well as different strategic considerations, Fort Ontario became outmoded as a defensive installation. From 1881 to 1884, it was temporarily ungarrisoned while undergoing sanitary improvements, and then ungarrisoned from 1894 to 1898 until the Spanish-American War prompted its reoccupation. Fort Ontario was then abandoned again from 1901 to 3, except for an ordnance sergeant, one person who served as a caretaker. Fort Ontario did have a moat, but it was removed in 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt and his Secretary of War, Elihu Root, wanted to reform Army capabilities to help the United States exercise a new role as emerging world power. As shown in the previous frame, the dry moat was removed. Also removed in 1902 was the fort's outer works. As shown in the bottom picture here in this frame, several red buildings were built outside the fort itself, but on the 75-acre Fort Ontario Military Reservation grounds. In the top picture, you see some of the tents for training of would-be troops. Infantry were garrisoned at the post until 1916. Then the 123rd Coast Artillery Company of New York National Guard took over. In these two postcard visuals, you see that Fort Ontario functioned as General Hospital No. 5 during World War I. The hospital treated medical, surgical, tubercular, and venereal cases. 30 new frame buildings were constructed outside of the fort itself, as well as the red brick buildings being used. Doctors, nurses, and ambulance companies trained at Fort Ontario before being transferred to the war in Europe. Thousands of sick and wounded soldiers from overseas were unloaded from ships at New York City Harbor and then transported on special hospital trains to Fort Ontario. Sick or injured soldiers from posts around the United States were also brought to Fort Ontario Hospital. With the end of World War I, Fort Ontario was converted back to an infantry garrison post. Most of the years until the start of World War II, Fort Ontario was the headquarters for a battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment. Oswego residents in the summer would enjoy seeing the dress parades of this small contingent of U.S. troops. They would enjoy the summer band concerts and the athletic events taking place on the fort grounds. Then came World War II. The United States initially was trying to stay out of the war that started in September 1931. But the Roosevelt administration began an extensive U.S. military buildup. As part of this military buildup, it was decided that Fort Ontario would be the ideal location for the establishment of an anti-aircraft artillery unit training facility. In January 8, 1941, 1,800 men and officers of the all-black 369th Coast Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment arrived at Fort Ontario. In September 1941, Fort Ontario became a training center for military police and quartermasters. In 1943, Fort Ontario became one of only 2 Army posts in the United States for illiterate soldiers and those born and educated in foreign countries who could not read or understand English. Starting in February 1944, Fort Ontario became a strictly military post. The U.S. Army had vacated Fort Ontario by March 1944. Starting in June 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt established Fort Ontario as the only emergency refugee shelter in the United States for mostly Jewish victims escaping Nazism. In the 18 months of its operation, 982 European refugees lived in the buildings on the Fort Ontario property as special guests of President Roosevelt himself. This will be discussed in a separate podcast in the Our Finger Lakes History series. In 1946, Fort Ontario property reverted back to the state of New York. This was in accordance with an 1839 New York state law requiring Fort Ontario to be returned if and when the United States no longer needed it. From 1947 to 53, the New York State Housing Authority administered the fort as a temporary housing project for World War II veterans and their families. In 1949, steps began to make Fort Ontario into a New York State historic site. Since the 1980s, efforts have been made to restore the fort to its appearance in the period 1868 until 1972. In 1989, the Friends of Fort Ontario Incorporated was chartered by the New York State Education Department. This is a view of what Fort Ontario looks like today. It is a great place for the entire family to visit and get an idea of what Fort Ontario was like in the last part of the 19th century. Here a young person tells about the eating place for the soldiers stationed at Fort Ontario shortly after the Civil War. This shows the nature of the bunker underneath the dirt coverings. In these bunkers, there were different-sized openings from which the troops could fire upon would-be attackers. As I said, Fort Ontario is a great family thing to do as a visit. Youth will enjoy seeing the reenactors in post-Civil War uniforms. Youth will enjoy climbing the earth embankments to see the beautiful view of Lake Ontario, and they will enjoy going underground to see all the areas underneath those earth banks. Of course, you can also visit the Safe Haven Museum on the Fort Ontario grounds. I hope you're enjoying this Fort Ontario program. It is a rather unique part of our Finger Lakes history. I want to close by acknowledging formally the sources of information and especially the visuals that I used in this program. I hope you've learned a great deal about the history of Fort Ontario. It is another part of our Finger Lakes history.